Welcome to Agile Coaches Corner by AgileThought, the podcast for practitioners and leaders seeking advice to refine the way they work and pave the path to better outcomes. Now, here's your host, coach, and Agile expert, Dan Neumann.
Welcome to Coaches Corner. I'm Dan Neumann, Senior Agile Coach at AgileThought. And with me is one of my AgileThought colleagues, Quincy Jordan, a principal transformation consultant, and he holds the distinction of co-authoring all 3 editions of the Scrum body of knowledge. So thanks for taking time to join us today, Quincy.
Hey, Dan. Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right. Today's topic is going to be about communities of practice. And, sometimes I feel like we get stuck in fancy words in our industry. So for folks who maybe aren't familiar with a community of practice, how would you describe that?
So, I would describe a community of practice as simply a group or body of individuals that have some common interest, common practice, some commonality where they come together on some frequency, some cadence to really just kind of fine tune their craft. And talk about their interests as it pertains to that particular topic. If you think of how meetups are run, communities of practice are very similar. I mean, a meetup is really basically a community of practice that's open to whatever individuals that are part of that meetup. But they can exist within organizations and different companies, and there's a whole host of reasons that we'll probably get into today to have communities of practice.
Yeah, definitely. I like that analogy of meetup groups because I think it takes some of the formality, the mystery of what a community of practice is. It's a group of folks getting together to learn something. So, you mentioned mutual interest, having a cadence, and then kind of the focus on their craft being 3 elements that go into that.
Yep.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah. And I think one of the things I like about communities of practice is that they can be as formal or informal, maybe as is appropriate. So sometimes there's formal membership, but most often I think it's just people who are interested opt into that. Is that similar to how you see things?
It is. I actually think it's better where it's formal in terms of, yes, there should be some structure there so that the community of practice is sustainable, but I don't think it's necessarily the best idea to make it a requirement or mandatory that folks should join that particular community of practice, especially my view oftentimes is from the perspective of transforming organizations. And so when you have communities of practices that are being used as a mechanism for transformation, oftentimes that question does actually come up. Well, do we need to make it mandatory or required for folks to come? And my response is generally, well, no, not really. We want to make it available. Yes, we want to incentivize folks to come and we want to encourage, but it's kind of like, do you really want to force people to come and talk about stuff? That's not probably going to be all that much fun.
Right. Yeah, I think I've seen that where you have people who, for some reason, feel an obligation to attend, but they're not engaging. And that it just kills the mood. It sucks the energy out of the group, something awful.
Yeah, we don't particularly advocate the check box attendees.
No, definitely. So you mentioned communities of practice as they relate to transformation. And I think that's something to maybe pull on a little bit. So you're a transformation consultant. We alluded to that in the introduction. How do you see communities of practice playing a role for organizations that are trying to really increase their agility?
Sure. So one thing is when you're looking at a transformation, there are so many different aspects to it, aside from just that you're trying to have that organization to transform from doing something one way to doing it another. But there's also significant knowledge transfer that needs to take place. There's significant education that needs to take place. And more importantly, which encompasses all of what I'm saying now, is the culture needs to transform as well. And so when you have a community of practice, if you think about So I'll give an example. There's a client that I was working with recently, and I am fairly certain, because where our entry point was with that particular client, I'm fairly certain if I would have gone in and said, hey, look, I want to meet with all of your Scrum Masters, and there's some perspectives and approaches I would like to go over with them and make sure that everyone is aligned, I don't think they would have said okay, because that wasn't our entry point at that time. So instead, what I did was I said, okay, well, I'm going to help you guys to establish a Scrum Master community of practice. Oh, and guess what? Guess who's there? All the Scrum Masters in the organization. So it was a very easy and strategic way to gather everyone who has that interest in either being a Scrum Master, either they were currently a Scrum Master or they want to be a Scrum Master, or they're just interested in understanding more about the Scrum Master role. It was a very strategic and easy way to get all of them in a room on a very regular basis. We set up a frequency cadence for it. And anything that I noticed were challenges across either different teams or different products, I could easily introduce at the community of practice. And let's say if there were maybe 17 different Scrum Masters there, 15 to 17 or so, that represented 15 to 17 different teams. And in that environment, that was over maybe 3 or 4 different products. So it was a very easy and strategic way, and I hate to keep saying that, but it was, to be able to disseminate knowledge across the organization, across different products, across different teams in one shot, and to be able to evaluate how effective that is all at the same time. So that wasn't a too long of a answer to a short question.
No, I don't think so. You did touch on something in there that I thought was really, well, you touched on several things that are important. One, a really valuable way to reach across the organization easily. The ability to have 17 teams represented and interacting with each other, like that doesn't happen very often in a lot of companies. People get into their little silos and they get stuck there just talking to the same people they talk to every day. So now you've got this really broad perspective.
Correct. And I like to even take it a step further. So I give another example from another past client. And so in this particular environment, they had product managers, UX, software engineers. That was kind of like the crux of the makeup. And so we established a community of practice for each one of those capabilities. So the initial thought sometimes is, wait, but aren't you creating silos by doing that? And the short answer is yes and no. So we are creating silos in terms of that particular community of practice is focused on that particular capability. But as I said earlier, it's not mandatory, it's not required, and it's open to everyone.
Yeah.
And if you are very strategic about it, you can also, and these are some of the things that I've done before, is invite folks from one community of practice into another community of practice as guest speakers. So let's say if it were a Scrum Master community of practice, and what we're going to focus on for this particular event is, or this particular session is that, well, we're going to focus on how the Scrum Master can help support and work with the product owner. So in that case, we would bring in some key folks that are product owners out of the product owner community of practice as guest speakers into the Scrum Master community of practice. And then you have a room full of Scrum Masters or folks that are interested in that, and they have the opportunity to hear firsthand the perspective from the product owner, and the product owner kind of give some insight and respond to some questions. And then they can also, in turn, build some empathy towards the role of the Scrum Master at the same time. So it is siloed, but it also kind of breaks down some of the silo at the same time.
Right. Yeah. When you said siloed and then the description you used, the word that came to mind for me was almost focus. Like it's the focus is product management. The focus is UX.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's a better way of looking at it. Yeah. I like that.
And the other thing I think you mentioned that was also really important is you don't have to have the title of Scrum Master to go to the Scrum Master community of practice. We're not checking credentials when people come in the door. It's like, if you're interested in the topic, the door's open, come on in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I like to even take it a step further and say, not only do you not have to have the title, you don't even have to have any of the experience. The only thing that you need to have is an interest, as we said earlier, as far as what a community of practice is. So you just have to have the interest. I don't really know anything about that particular thing, but I'm interested in learning more about it, and you show up. And from there, you start growing and start learning and start contributing and participating and so forth.
Definitely. Yeah, I could, a product manager who's attending the Scrum Master community of practice or vice versa, I think they're going to learn a lot. And, we talk about T-shaped skills in the Agile community where you have a deep specialization and then some generalization as well. And communities of practice can be a great place to start to kind of broaden out the top of that T for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I personally see the communities of practice as like the secret ingredient to transformations. I think it flies completely under the radar oftentimes. And what you'll find is even when a transformation does not intentionally and strategically use community of practice as a mechanism, you'll find that it sometimes will start cropping up on its own because folks will just kind of start getting together and talking about some things, and then that kind of grows, and then that kind of grows, and then that kind of grows. And they may not formally call it a community of practice, but in function, it's still the same thing.
Agreed. One of the analogies I use when people are trying to figure out what a community of practice is, I'm like, you think of not so much anymore. You think of the smokers, and they go outside together, and you've got all these different skills represented. They're talking about everything that's going on in the company, the rumor mill, what they're working on, and in a way, this is like a healthier version of the smoking community of practice. So a very informal one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I recently did a post on LinkedIn. And what I mentioned in the post was that if a transformation was, how did I put it? If a transformation was the Colonel's 11 herbs and spices, then a community of practice would be one of those.
Nice. I like that. We'll make sure to get a link to that on the show notes page and make sure folks can find that. I love analogies. It really helps wrap one's head around what some of these concepts are, makes them so much more approachable.
Yeah.
Have a topic you want us to tackle? Send an email to podcast@agilethought.com or tweet it with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast.
I wanted to talk, you'd alluded to incentivizing and encouraging people to attend. We don't want to make it a requirement, and we don't want that incentive to destroy the intrinsic motivation of going, much like a lot of times rewards and bribes to do something can. What types of incentives have you seen work? I mean, for me, food. You feed people and they will show up. That to me is kind of one of the bigger incentives. But I was curious what you thought.
Yeah, food definitely does it, for sure. Sometimes because of the timing, food isn't always and sometimes because of the budget, food isn't always, something that they can do. So with one past client, and I'll kind of get to how I'm going to answer the question in just a second. But one past client, so when we first started, the initial product manager community of practice was, I think it was maybe around 40 to 60, I believe, folks that were showing up fairly consistently. And we grew that to slightly over 200 that were showing up on a regular basis. So if you say, well, are we going to provide food for 200 people plus, like every time? That's kind of a tough one. But, there are some other ways to incentivize folks. One is I always recommend and strongly encourage, and from a transformation standpoint, I really require that the community of practice is led by a team, not by an individual. So you can hear these, sad stories of communities of practices that started at an organization. It was going really great. And then the person that was heading it up either left the company or they just got really busy with too many different things. And then it started waning off. And next thing you know, folks are talking about, what happened with the community of practice that used to be and how it used to be so good and so forth. So I always recommend that there's always a team. That team often referred to as Agile champions, assuming that it's an Agile transformation, but they're always referred to as champions, be it Agile or any other approach. And so with that group of champions, that also means if you are a champion, then you're now by default in a high visibility position because you're having to help facilitate the communities of practice, the different events, and help coordinate things. You may have to reach out to different folks to bring in guest speakers, and then showing some of the effectiveness to leadership. So that opportunity for the high visibility within the organization is an incentive. So then sometimes the question comes up, well, but does that incentivize people to just kind of do it so they can be seen? Well, maybe initially they can have that perspective, but once the work starts, they quickly weed themselves out. So there's another client, and I helped them to start their community of practice, and I said, "Hey, well, our first thing is we're going to need to identify some Agile champions, and these are, the criteria and the kinds of things that we're looking for in an Agile champion." And I kind of suspected that they heard the word champion and didn't hear the rest of it. And so as we started getting into it and we started preparing for events, they were very quick to say, okay, sorry, this isn't what I thought. Like, it's not as much glory in it as I thought it was going to be when I heard the word champion. So there's a bit more effort and grunge work going on than what I thought was going to happen. And so that quickly, they weeded themselves out. They selected themselves out. And eventually they probably will come back in.
Right. And I think the champion role is a very active one. One of the things I think also goes with it related to the champion is having that sponsor. So somebody who is providing support, whether it's financial support for budgetary things, if you can get the food, that's awesome. And also for time, those champions, those people who are leading the communities of practice need to invest some time in that activity to make sure that communication is happening and they're bringing in other people and doing the follow-ups that might come out of that. So those people who might not be able to do as much of the grunt work, was the phrase, might be able to help clear some hurdles for the time and the money that goes with some of those things, kind of lending their name. It's one of those things, managers, what can a manager do in an Agile organization? It's help clear those organizational hurdles for time and energy and putting in that investment over time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that actually brings up a really good point, because the community of practice is just as anything else. It's only going to be as effective as it is supported. And if it's not supported by leadership, if the organization doesn't support it, and it doesn't have to be supported by everyone. It's like you said, you just need a good, solid sponsor, preferably, again, a team, just like there's a team of champions that facilitate and run the community of practice. It's better if there's also a transformation team that helps support that effort from a strategic standpoint as well. But it's definitely important to have some folks that will clear the path, make it a little easier to get things going, and where folks don't have to scramble for space, meeting space, and the other logistical things that can slow things down.
Right. Yeah, you'd mentioned your product owner example where you had a couple hundred people. That space becomes a very meaningful challenge at that point.
Yes.
And so, yeah, the somebody who can engage with facilities. One of the anti-patterns I've seen, we talked about a team. I've seen a rotating, kind of like a handoff. So you think of it like a relay race where somebody runs for a quarter of the lap and then they hand the baton to somebody else, where each session or each couple sessions had a different facilitator. And that fell over very fast. At some point, somebody dropped the baton and it just died. I don't know. Have you seen that too versus a true team where everybody's working together?
I have. And it's just as you said, it can work okay, but it's bound to run into significant challenges, because at some point it's going to conflict with one person. And if that one person happens to be the person that is supposed to take the helm at that time, then you're going to run into the same situation as if it was only one person from the beginning. So I have found far more success in having a team, because even with having a team, I'll go back to another example. So there were, I believe, 5 champions identified on the team, and there were, for lack of a better term, a reorg that was about to take place. And so that was causing a change in the atmosphere in the company. And so as we were preparing for what we refer to as forums and core practice talks, one way that we utilize as a mechanism within community of practice, 3 of the champions showed up and the other 2 did not. And so it was fine. And then when we got into our forum, one of those 2 that didn't show up showed up, and one that actually did show up for the prep didn't show up. So we still had 3 different facilitators there. So it's really better if you do have that team, because something's always going to fall through. And if you don't have a backup, then that's where you run into problems. So it's just much better to have a team so that you have some built-in redundancy, so that you don't lose that consistency.
Definitely. Implicitly, we touched on some tips for getting a community started, and maybe as we close out this podcast, we can share a couple examples of this. So a team of champions was one of the things that we'd alluded to. Having a sponsor who can help clear some of those organizational hurdles, time, money, kind of lending their name and their coattails to it. Having a location that's suitable. Food, I love food, and getting people there, especially if it's over lunch, get them the food. Like, I don't care if it's 5 people or 200 people. Like, if you're asking somebody to contribute their lunch, kick in the food. What other tips might you have for getting a community going?
So I think the last thing that you just said actually is one of the other things to consider, is the timing of when the community of practice meets. So you do have to be very conscientious about that. Do we meet during lunch? And if we do, then, as you said, definitely we need to spring for food. Now, you can also sometimes take an approach where it's a brown bag thing, but I like to be a little careful around not mixing the concept of a lunch and learn with the communities of practice, because so that people make sure that they're very clear on what the activity is. But some of the other things to consider is when you are seeking that sponsorship, that leadership really needs to know things as far in advance as possible. So if you can set out a roadmap and say, every so many weeks we're going to meet, and we anticipate it will be X number of people. Maybe every so many weeks in between those we meet, and we anticipate it'll be so many people, or we'll meet once every 2 months or something like that. I wouldn't extend the meeting time, the cadence too long. Typically, I wouldn't go past about 6 weeks, because if you go past that, people you lose your momentum, and you may never even build it like you really intend to. So how you're going to build a momentum is something very important for folks to keep in mind, and keeping the sponsorship very aware as far in advance as possible. Everyone else doesn't need to know far in advance, but leadership, they do have to consider budget. They do have to consider, timing. They do have to consider those things. And you want to be empathetic to the leadership, the same way you want the leadership to be empathetic to the teams and those who are trying to build their knowledge base.
Definitely. Yeah. Cadence is critical. I know you'd alluded to 6 weeks. I love, for some communities, a weekly cadence makes sense. Sometimes it's every couple weeks. I find that when it gets out to 3 and 4 weeks, people start to get back together and they don't remember the last session they had together.
Yeah.
And then the clear purpose was also something that you touched on in there, just making sure that people know is this a place where they show up and listen? Is this a place where they show up and engage? Like making sure that they know what the community of practice is for.
Yeah. And actually, I am a firm believer that actually needs to be stated every time the community meets. Like every single time, there's a quick blurb right at the beginning that says, hey, this is the community of Scrum Masters, and this is our purpose, this is our vision, this is what we seek to do, and this is our topic for today, or this is how it will run today.
Very cool. Yeah. Having that framework is outstanding. Well, good. Thanks for exploring the topic of communities of practice. I want to shift to something that's going to be a recurring part of these podcasts, and that is focusing on continuous learning as folks in a knowledge economy and folks who are doing Agile work are trying to continue to stay relevant. I feel like reading and continuing to grow is super important. And so I'm curious what you're reading these days.
Sure. So I'm very big on nonverbal communication. That is the number one way that we communicate as human beings, long before anything that we say. But our nonverbal is very important. So What Everybody is Saying by Joe Navarro, I think is a good read, that's out there. There are plenty of others on nonverbal communication, but I find that to be very important in transformation work, really just all the way around. I think it just helps if you're pretty good at recognizing some of the cues that we give off as human beings. And so anything around body language and communication, I think, is very key.
That's cool. I have not read that book. It's on my backlog, but it hasn't quite got to the top. Is it, for folks that are interested, is it something that you find building your own awareness of your own body language and maybe the signals you're sending? Does it talk about how to read the signals of other people? Is it both? Like how has that helped you?
It's a little bit of both. And yeah, so it's what you notice from other folks giving off and what you can be more conscious of that you're giving off yourself, and how to interpret some of that. Just as with anything else, and like when someone takes a polygraph and those kinds of things, it's not about what someone does one time, but it's about the patterns that they show and the conditions in which they demonstrate them. And so I find that to be very useful when negotiating, when trying to relate to clients or potential clients, and and also, let's face it, just because you're spot on with what you're seeing and interpreting doesn't mean that you can actually do anything about it.
Sure.
But it does make you aware of it.
Yes, something that, while I haven't read that book while you were describing it, I've read a different book called Humble Inquiry, and it's about being able to genuinely be curious about what's happening. And so I would imagine if you're seeing certain signals being sent off, then there's the opportunity to go, hey, maybe I'm noticing this, and genuinely be curious about what is causing that. Did I say something? Are you concerned about approach, the question, the proposal, whatever's on the table there. And so just genuinely being humble and curious, not in a leading questions kind of way, or not in trying to trap somebody in the questions kind of way, but just really being curious.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. So we'll put a link to what everybody is saying then as well on this. And so with that, thank you very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And it's been very enjoyable. Hopefully I'll be able to come back.
Of course.
And I had a great time.
Look for the calendar invite.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thanks, Quincy.
This has been the Agile Coaches Corner podcast, brought to you by AgileThought. Get the show notes and other helpful tips from this episode and other episodes at agilethought.com/podcast.